Welcome to episode 10. Today, we're exploring section 9 of Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. We'll be tracing the transformation he describes from what he calls gentile society to early civilization.
That's right. And our mission really in this deep dive is just to unpack this specific part of the source material you shared. We want to understand the author's perspective on this huge shift.
Yeah, how society's structures fundamentally changed as humanity moved, from those earlier stages into what this text calls civilization.
Exactly. We're focusing right in on how those older kinship systems, the ones based on family ties, which have been around forever, seemingly, how they start to break down.
And give way to totally new ways of organizing society.
Right. Things we take for granted now, maybe like private property, social classes, and, crucially, the state. And just to be clear, we're sticking strictly to the ideas presented right here in this text.
Okay, got it. So let's unpack this. Where does the source actually start this story?
Well, it sets the scene back in what it terms the lower stage of barbarism. And the main example used here is the American Indians, describing a society running under what's called a fully formed gentile constitution.
A gentile constitution. What exactly does that look like, according to the text?
It's all based on kinship, on blood relations. Think of it like layers of family groups. You have the basic unit, the gens, like a clan.
Okay.
Then as populations grow, related gents group together into freight trees.
Freight trees, right.
And then these freight trees form tribes. And sometimes tribes might even band together into confederacies. It's all built on those blood ties.
And what's interesting in his description is what's not there, isn't it? He really highlights some key characteristics of this stage.
He does, yeah. He calls it simple, suited for the conditions, but a really crucial point for his argument. It has no place for ruler and ruled.
No rulers. How did that function?
Well, the argument presented is that in this structure, there wasn't this formal separation we think of between rights and duties. So taking part in public affairs, or even things like blood revenge or making amends, the text suggests these weren't seen as specific jobs or entitlements. They were just natural parts of life, like sleeping or hunting.
Just what you did.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And because of how it was organized and its economic foundation, the text argues it was actually impossible for society to split into distinct classes at that point.
Okay, so let's dig into that economic base he mentions. What does the source say daily life and work looks like?
It describes a pretty sparse population, mostly gathered in settlements, and the division of labor is, well, very basic. It's really only split between the sexes.
Man and woman, completely separate spheres of work.
That's how the text presents it, yes. The man's job is war, hunting, fishing, getting the raw materials. He makes the tools for that, weapons, and so on.
Right.
The woman's sphere is the house, preparing food, making clothes, cooking, weaving. She makes and owns the household stuff. The source actually says each is the master in their own area. Man in the forest, woman in the house.
And property, then, is tied directly to that. You own the tools you personally make and use. But you also mentioned communal housekeeping.
That's right.
Yeah.
The text points out that housekeeping was often done communally, among several families living together.
Okay.
And whatever was made and used in common, like the house itself, maybe a shared garden plot, or a big canoe that was common property.
I see.
And this is where the text makes a really pointed claim. It says this stage, and only this stage really, shows the actual existence of property created by the owner's labor, a concept it argues gets twisted later on in civilized society.
Okay, so that's the baseline. Kinship, no classes, some communal property, simple division of labor by sex. But obviously, things didn't stay that way. The source talks about the first great social division of labor. How did that happen?
Right. Not everyone stayed in that hunter-gatherer mode. The text points to a geographical shift, especially over in Asia, where some tribes started taming and breeding animals.
Ah, so the beginning of pastoralism, herding animals.
Exactly. Some tribes that were apparently more advanced. The text mentions Aryans, Semites, Mediterraneans. They specialized in raising cattle. And this focus was so significant, it led these pastoral tribes to separate themselves from the other groups, the other barbarians.
And the source calls that the first major division.
Yes, the first great social division of labor, that shift to herding.
And this must have had huge economic effects, right? Beyond just having meat on the hoof.
Oh, massive consequences.
Yeah.
These tribes started producing way more, and different things too, not just meat, but milk, cheese, hides, wool, and eventually woven fabrics from the wool. A whole new range of necessities.
And that surplus, that new variety, made something else possible.
Regular exchange.
Yeah.
Before this, any exchange was pretty minimal, maybe just occasional swaps within a tribe.
Right.
But now you've got specialized pastoral tribes with distinct products. So according to the text, exchange between branches of different tribes becomes a regular thing, a normal institution.
And the animals themselves, the cattle, they played a specific role in this new system.
Absolutely central. The text says cattle became the main thing people exchanged. They were so important they actually became the standard for valuing other goods. They started acting like early money.
Wow, okay.
Cattle acquired a money function, is the exact phrase used. This need for some kind of money commodity just popped up with such necessity and speed once regular exchange got going. And
Interesting.
it also notes that some farming, horticulture came later, often just to grow fodder for the animals. Land was still tribal property, though. People might use plots temporarily assigned to the gens or a household or individuals, but it wasn't private ownership yet, just limited rights of possession.
Okay. Now, beyond herding, the source mentions other technological steps forward happening around this stage, too.
Yes, some pretty important ones. The invention of the loom for weaving cloth,
Ooh.
and learning how to smelt metal ores, copper, and tin, and make bronze.
Oh, the Bronze Age.
Right. Bronze for tools and weapons. Though the text notes stone tools didn't disappear overnight. Iron smelting wasn't known yet. Gold and silver were also being used, mostly for decoration, but they were already considered highly valuable.
So, all these advances, the herding, early farming, metalworking, weaving it, means human labor could now produce more than just basic survival needs.
Precisely. Human labor power could create a surplus. And this surplus, combined with the fact that the work itself was increasing, created a desire, a need for more labor.
And where did they find that extra labor?
War. War provided it.
So this is where slavery comes into the picture, according to this source.
Yes. Prisoners captured in war were turned into slaves. The text argues pretty directly that slavery wasn't just some random cruelty. It arose specifically out of this increased productivity and the accumulation of wealth. It was driven by the economics of this stage.
And this is presented as the very first major split within society itself.
That's exactly what the source claims. That first great social division of labor pastoralism under the historical conditions of the time fraught slavery with it. And this creates the first great cleavage in society. The split into masters and slaves, exploiters and exploited.
Wow. Okay, that is a fundamental shift. And this accumulation of wealth, particularly by the men who, according to the text, were managing the herds, this also had a revolutionary effect inside the family structure itself.
It really did. The text talks about how these herds, this new form of wealth, passed into the private ownership of the man. Now, the specifics of how that happened are apparently unknown, but it occurred during this stage.
Okay.
And since getting the necessities was traditionally the man's job, and now cattle were this major new source of wealth and necessities, well, the cattle and everything traded for them other goods, even the slaves captured, ended up belonging to him. The surplus wealth became his.
And the woman's position changed.
Yeah, the text argues she might share in enjoying the benefits, but she didn't own the wealth.
And this is contrasted with the earlier stage, where the woman held more sway in the household.
The source makes a really striking comparison. It says the savage hunter was sort of content with second place to the woman's role within the house. But the gentler shepherd, puffed up with his new wealth and arrogance, pushed himself into first place and essentially pushed the woman down.
So it wasn't necessarily that the woman stopped doing her domestic work, but that the work itself lost social value compared to the man's activities in acquiring this new form of wealth outside the home.
That's exactly the source's argument. The division of labor outside the family fundamentally changed the power dynamic within the family, even if the actual domestic tasks looked pretty similar. Her domestic labor just didn't count for as much, socially, compared to the man's wealth-generating work.
And the text connects this observation directly to the whole question of female emancipation.
Yes, it draws a clear line. It argues that emancipating women is actually impossible as long as they're shut out from what it calls social productive labor and basically confined to private domestic work. The source claims real emancipation is only possible when women can participate fully in large-scale social production, and domestic work becomes either minimal or a public service. A change it links explicitly to the rise of modern large-scale industry way down the line.
So this power shift within the family, the man's supremacy, also triggered a change in how kinship and inheritance worked.
Absolutely. It led directly, the text argues, to the overthrow of mother right, where descent and often property passed through the female line.
Right.
And instead, father right was introduced, tracing descent and inheritance through the male line. This transition also seems to coincide with the shift from pairing marriage towards monogamy, primarily enforced on the woman. The text implies to ensure the paternity of heirs and keep that growing wealth within the male lineage.
And what did this do to the old gentile order, the kinship system?
The text says this change tore a breach in that old system. The single family, now focused on accumulating its own private wealth under the man's control, became a distinct economic unit. And it became, in the source's words, a menace to the gens, because its interests were starting to clash with the collective interests of the larger kinship group.
Okay, let's move on then to the next stage the source lays out, the upper stage of barbarism. He calls this the heroic age. What's the defining feature here?
The really big technological leap now is iron. We're talking the iron sword, but also crucially, the iron plowshare for farming and the iron axe.
And iron changed things dramatically compared to bronze.
Oh yeah, iron tools meant you could cultivate much larger areas of land, clear forests more easily, and make much stronger, more durable tools for handicrafts. The text says progress across the board just accelerated significantly because of iron.
And how does society itself start to look different?
Well, we start seeing the growth of actual towns at this stage, often built with stone or brick walls.
Fortifications.
Right. The text calls this a huge architectural advance, but it also points out it's a pretty clear sign of increasing danger and the need for protection. And wealth just kept increasing rapidly, now described explicitly as individual wealth.
Okay. And with better tools and expanding production, you mentioned farming, adding things like wine and oil, handicrafts getting more varied. It sounds like it was getting harder for one person or family to do everything.
Precisely. The range of activities just became too much for one person. And this, according to the source, leads to the second great division of labor. Handicrafts completely separate from agriculture as specialized trades.
And what about slavery during this period?
It ramps up significantly. The increased production and productivity made human labor power even more valuable. Slavery, which maybe was more sporadic or smaller scale before, now becomes an essential part of the economic system, and it's large scale. The text uses the phrase, slaves were driven by dozens to work the fields and workshops.
And with this split between farming and crafts, plus the growing surpluses, production for exchange really becomes central.
Yes. What the text calls commodity production, making goods specifically to be traded, starts to dominate. And this naturally fosters the growth of commerce, both within regions and overseas.
Does money evolve further, too?
It does. Precious metals, gold and silver, tend to become the main general money commodity, though it's still usually exchanged by weight at this point, not typically as coined money yet.
So by the end of this upper stage of barbarism, we're seeing even more social divisions emerging.
Absolutely. Now, the distinction between rich and poor becomes really sharp, existing alongside that earlier division between freemen and slaves. The text identifies this as a clear splitting of society into distinct classes.
And how did this affect land ownership? That was still mostly communal earlier.
Right. But these differences in wealth among families started to break up those older communal household structures. Cultivated land, which might have been allocated temporarily before, began to be held by single families on a more permanent basis. It's a transition towards full private property and land. And the text argues this happens in parallel with the move towards monogamy becoming the standard family structure.
So the individual family unit becomes the core economic unit of society.
Yes, exactly. It's no longer the larger gens or the communal household, but the single family. That's the basic economic building block.
And with denser populations, the text says, organization needed to change.
Right. More people living closer together, more wealth. It required closer unity, both for internal management and external defense or expansion. Tribal confederacies started merging into larger territories, more like nations.
And leadership structures changed, too.
Yes. The military leader, the text, mentions various titles like res, basileus, theodens, becomes indispensable, especially as warfare, often for plunder, becomes, well, the text calls it a regular industry.
A regular industry, wow.
Yeah. So this leader's position tends to become permanent. We also see the development of the assembly of the people. These are organs from the old gentile society, but they're evolving into something the source calls a military democracy. Military organization becomes a central, regular feature of life.
That's an interesting take on war for plunder being normalized.
It is. The text presents it quite starkly. The wealth of neighboring peoples excites greed, and just taking riches through raiding comes to be seen as easier, maybe even more honorable, than productive work. Those fortified towns we mentioned are a direct result of this constant threat.
And internally, how did this rising importance of warfare and military leaders affect the old gentile structures?
It significantly increased the power of those military chiefs. An election, which was common in the old system, starts giving way to hereditary succession, especially once father right is established for inheritance. This, the text argues, lays the groundwork for hereditary monarchy and the beginnings of a nobility.
So the old kinship-based structure, that Gentile constitution, is really being transformed from the inside out here.
Definitely. The source argues its organs are essentially tearing loose from their roots in the kinship group, in the people. Their function changes dramatically. From being an organization for the community to freely manage its own affairs, they become, in this text view, tools for plundering and oppressing neighbors.
So the institutions themselves become instruments of domination.
Yes, instruments of domination and oppression, no longer just reflecting the collective will.
And what's the underlying cause driving this fundamental change, according to the source?
The text links it directly back to the greed for riches, which it says, split the old gentes into rich and poor factions. This destroyed their original unity of interest, creating antagonism instead. And the growth of slavery made productive labor seem demeaning, fit only for slaves, or at least less honorable than raiding. The old system, based on shared interests and public opinion, just couldn't handle these internal conflicts and this shift in values.
And this whole transition brings us right up to the edge of the final stage described in this section.
That's right. The text wraps up this long historical arc by stating, we have now reached the threshold of civilization.
Okay, so let's get the definition clear, based purely on this source material. What is civilization in this specific context?
Civilization is presented as the stage of development where that division of labor we've tracked, along with individual exchange between producers, and production specifically for exchange commodity production, where all that reaches its full development and basically revolutionizes the whole of society.
And how is that fundamentally different from what came before?
Well, in those earlier stages, the source argues, production was generally collective, and goods were distributed pretty directly within the community, the gens, or the household. Producers largely controlled their own work process and the product itself.
It stayed within their control.
Yeah, the product didn't really leave their hands or their immediate community's control. There weren't these outside, unaccountable forces messing with things, what the text calls incorporeal alien powers.
But under civilization, that changes.
Completely. That division of labor subtly undermines the old collectivity. It promotes individual appropriation, individuals owning things, and that creates the basis for widespread exchange. Eventually, commodity production making stuff primarily to sell on a market becomes the dominant mode.
And in that system, the person making the product loses control over it.
Exactly. Once you exchange your product, you surrender it. You don't know its ultimate fate. Then you get intermediaries involved, money, merchants complicating things even further. Products move from market to market. And crucially, the text argues, the individual producer loses control over the total production within their sphere of activity. Even the merchants don't really control it. Production and the products themselves become subject to chance.
Chance. That seems odd. But the text connects this idea of chance to necessity, right?
Yes, this is a really core theoretical point in the source. It argues that the more social production seems to escape conscious control, the more it seems random or chaotic, the more surely the underlying economic laws governing it assert themselves anyway, almost like laws of nature. They operate as if by natural necessity. These economic laws appear to individuals as alien, external forces, and the text puts it very powerfully. The product rules the producer. The whole system ends up being regulated by these blind laws, which manifest themselves with elemental violence. The example given is trade crises, market crashes. This dominance of seemingly blind economic forces is presented as a defining feature of civilization.
And tied into this is the idea that human labor itself can become just another commodity.
Right. The source points out that this truth, that a human being's labor power could be bought and sold, emerged quite early on, linked back to that initial surplus production and division of labor we discussed. People themselves were exchanged initially as slaves.
And slavery, the text argues, is really the first characteristic form of exploitation under civilization.
Yes, reaching its fullest development in the ancient world. The source then identifies three main forms of servitude across the major historical periods of civilization it recognizes. First, slavery in antiquity, then serfdom in the Middle Ages, and finally, wage labor in the modern era. And the text asserts that throughout this entire epoch of civilization, society has been fundamentally split into exploiting and exploited classes, always accompanied by some form of slavery, whether it's open or disguised.
So, if we were to summarize the key economic markers of civilization, according to this source, what would they be?
The text lists several. The widespread use of metal money and the development that comes with it, money, capital, interest, usury. Then there's the rise of merchants as crucial intermediaries between producers. Also, the establishment of private ownership of land, along with the mortgage system. And initially, slave labor as the dominant form of production.
Okay, those are the economic features. And what about the key social or political features highlighted?
On the social side,
Hmm.
monogamy becomes the standard family form, which the text explicitly links to man's domination over woman. The single family, not the gens, becomes the basic economic unit of society. Politically, the state emerges as the central organizing link holding everything together, and a permanent opposition develops between town and country. The source also throws in the introduction of wills, the ability to dictate how your property is distributed after death. This was a radical break from the Gentile constitution, and the text notes examples in Athens, Rome, and how it was introduced among Germanic tribes, largely by the church wanting legacies.
And this brings us squarely back to the state itself. The source argues the old Gentile system just couldn't cope with all these new forces and conflict.
It was completely overwhelmed, basically helpless. The Gentile constitution worked when members were all related, settled together, relatively homogeneous. But populations became mixed. You had slaves, resident aliens, people moving around for trade or because land ownership changed.
So the old ways of meeting and deciding things broke down.
Exactly. Members couldn't easily gather for common affairs anymore. Plus, entirely new interests emerged. Handicraftsmen had different needs than farmers, townspeople different interests than country folk. These needed new organizing bodies outside the old kinship structure.
And there were also conflicts within the old groups.
Oh yeah, major ones. Conflicts between the newly rich and the newly poor, between creditors and debtors, even within the same gens. On top of that, the large mass of people outside the gentes, the slaves, the foreigners, became a significant force in society, like the plebeians in Rome.
So the old system became distorted.
The text argues the old Gentile bodies, designed for a society without these contradictions, turned into closed, privileged corporations. What was once a natural democracy became, in its words, a malign aristocracy.
And crucially, the Gentile constitution lacked the tools to enforce order amidst this level of conflict.
Right. Its main enforcement mechanism was public opinion, social pressure. That wasn't enough anymore. A society fundamentally split by these deep class antagonisms, unable to resolve them peacefully, could only continue, the text argues, in one of two ways, either constant open warfare between the classes or
Under the rule of a third power.
precisely, a power that appears to stand above the warring classes. Its stated purpose is to moderate the conflict, to keep things within the bounds of order.
And that power, that's the state.
That's the state. The source is very explicit. The state arose on the ruins of the Gentile constitution. And it specifically pushes back against other theories, arguing the state isn't imposed from outside, nor is it some kind of ideal realization of reason, like Hegel suggested.
It's presented as a direct product of specific societal conditions.
Absolutely. It's framed as a product of society reaching a stage of insoluble self-contradiction, point where it's cleft into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to exercise.
So the state became necessary because society couldn't manage its own conflicts anymore.
Yes, it became necessary, the source says, precisely to moderate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And while it arises out of society, the text strongly emphasizes that the state also places itself above society, becoming increasingly alienated from it.
And the text then lays out some key characteristics of this new entity, the state, showing how different it is from the old ways. The first one is its basis in territory.
That's right. Instead of organizing people based on who they're related to, the state groups its members based on where they live. This was a radical departure from the Gentile system. And the source notes it actually took quite a struggle to implement this in places like ancient Athens and Rome, even though it seems perfectly natural to us now.
Okay. The second characteristic mentioned is something new called a public force.
Yes, a special body of armed people, police, prisons, coercive institutions, that is separate from the general population arming itself.
And why is that needed?
Because, the text argues, once society is split into classes with opposing interests, a self-acting armed organization of the entire population becomes impossible. It gives the example of the Athenian democracy's army, which wasn't just for external defense, but also needed to keep the large slave population in check, functioning as an aristocratic public force in that sense. A separate police force became necessary even just to manage conflicts among citizens.
Yeah.
This public force, armed men, prisons, etc., was unknown in Gentile society. And the source argues it tends to grow stronger as class conflicts within society sharpens, and also as neighboring states become larger and more powerful. It points to modern Europe as an example where this public power has grown so immense it actually threatens to consume both society and the state itself.
And the third key characteristic, how is this public force paid for?
Taxes. Contributions levied on the citizens specifically to maintain this public power and the whole state apparatus. Again, something completely unknown to Gentile society. The source adds a little comment here, saying that we today know more than enough about them.
Yeah.
And as civilization advances, taxes often aren't even enough. So states resort to loans, creating public debt. Our old Europe can tell a tale about these too, the text remarks.
And the people who actually run this state, the officials, the bureaucrats, their position is totally different from the old Gentile chiefs, isn't it?
Completely different. They present themselves and are seen as organs standing above society. They don't receive that automatic, free-willing respect that Gentile chiefs got simply by being part of the community and embodying its traditions.
So they need something else.
They need special laws granting them authority, sanctity, inviolability. The source makes a really potent contrast. It says even the lowest police officer in the civilized state possesses more authority than all the organs of Gentile society put together. Yet even the mightiest ruler might envy the humble Gentile chief for the unforced and unquestioned respect he received because the chief was organically part of society, whereas the state official stands outside and above it.
Okay. So based on all that, its origins and conflict, its characteristics, the source presents a very clear view of what the state fundamentally is and whose interests it primarily serves.
Yes, the core argument is that the state is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class. This class uses its economic power to also become the politically dominant class, and then it uses the state as a tool, acquiring new means to hold down and exploit the oppressed classes.
And it provides historical examples to back this up.
It does. It points to the ancient state as the state of the slave owners for holding down the slaves, the feudal state as the organ of the nobility for holding down the peasant serfs, and the modern representative state as the instrument of capital for the exploitation of wage labor.
But it does acknowledge exceptions to this rule.
It mentions what it calls exceptional periods. These are times when the warring classes are balanced so evenly that state power can gain a temporary independence from both, acting as an apparent mediator.
Like what?
Examples given include the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, balancing the declining nobility and the rising bourgeoisie. Also, Bonapartism in France, playing the proletariat off against the bourgeoisie. And closer to the time of writing, the Bismarckian German Empire, presented as balancing capitalists and workers, mainly for the benefit of the Prussian landowning aristocracy, the Junkers.
The source also touches on how political rights are often explicitly linked to property within states, doesn't it?
Yes, things like the property-based classes that determined political rights in ancient Athens and Rome, or how land ownership qualified people for power in the Middle Ages, or even modern electoral qualifications based on property ownership or tax payments. The source sees these as direct proof that the state exists to protect the possessing class against the non-possessing class, calling this system of graded rights a low stage of state development.
And then it moves on to discuss the Democratic Republic. How was that presented?
It's described as the highest form that the state takes under modern conditions, becoming an unavoidable necessity in many ways. It's also seen as the political arena, where the last decisive battle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie will be fought out.
But critically, the Democratic Republic doesn't officially recognize property differences in its political setup.
Exactly. Formally, everyone is equal. But, the source argues, wealth still exercises its power, just indirectly.
How?
It identifies two main methods. First, straightforward corruption of officials. The text calls America the classic example of this at the time. Second, through an alliance between government and stock exchange. This alliance is made easier, it argues, by things like growing state debt and the rise of joint stock companies, which concentrate transport and production and whose activities are centered on the stock exchange. It cites examples in France, Switzerland, England, and Germany.
Okay. And what's the take on universal suffrage, everyone getting the vote?
It's presented in a quite specific way. The text argues that the possessing class rules directly through universal suffrage, but only for a certain period. It rules this way until the oppressed class, the working class, becomes ripe for its self-liberation.
So suffrage changes its meaning.
As the working class matures politically, it begins to use universal suffrage to organize its own independent party and elect its own representatives. So the source calls universal suffrage the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It predicts that the day universal suffrage registers the boiling point for the workers, both the workers and the capitalists will know where they stand politically.
Okay, let's zoom back out for a second. A really crucial point the source keeps making is that the state hasn't always existed.
That's fundamental to the whole argument. Societies existed for immense periods without any state or governmental power as we know it. The state only became necessary, it argues, because of the emergence of class divisions at a particular stage of economic development.
And just as it arose historically, the text predicts it will also disappear.
Yes. The argument is that society is rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production where the existence of these classes is not only no longer necessary, but actually becomes a positive hindrance to production.
So classes become obsolete.
They will fall as inevitably as they once arose, the text says. And since the state is seen as a product of class conflict, the conclusion drawn is that the state inevitably falls with them.
And what does the source imagine replacing it? What does the future society look like?
It envisions a society that reorganizes production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers.
And the state in that future?
In that future society, the text famously predicts, the entire state machinery will be relegated to where it belongs. In the Museum of Antiquities, next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe.
Wow. Okay, the section you shared wraps up by bringing in the perspective of Lewis Morgan, the anthropologist whose work Engels was drawing on so heavily. What was Morgan's take on civilization's impact?
Yes, the text quotes Morgan's concluding judgment. He felt that the sheer growth of property had become this unmanageable power, overwhelming the people, leaving the human mind sort of bewildered in its presence.
But Morgan wasn't entirely pessimistic. He had a vision for moving beyond this.
He did. He expressed a kind of faith that human intelligence would eventually rise to the challenge, that it would master property, clearly define the relationship between the state and the property it protects, and set limits on the rights of property owners. Morgan strongly asserts that the interests of society as a whole are paramount and must ultimately be brought into harmony with individual interests.
And his final thought is quite powerful, isn't it?
It really is. Morgan concludes that a life course focused purely on acquiring property, a mere property career, cannot be the final destiny of humankind. Progress, he believed, demanded something more. He saw civilization itself with its focus on property as just one phase, a historical fragment.
And he thought it might end.
He suggested its dissolution, bids fair to become the termination of a career of which property is the end and aim, precisely because, in his view, such a system contains the elements of self-destruction.
But he saw signs of something better emerging.
Yes. He pointed to the growing trends of democracy, the ideal of universal brotherhood, the demand for equality, the spread of education. He saw these as foreshadowing the next higher plane of society. And he described this future plane, very strikingly, as a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes. A return to those ancient ideals, but on a more advanced level.
What a huge historical narrative. So just to recap, we started with this description from the source of an early society based on kinship ties, with largely communal property, no real classes, and no formal state.
And we've traced, following the argument laid out entirely in this text, how that transformed, how private property emerged, how society split into classes, how production for exchange came to dominate, and how the state arose as this necessary coercive power designed specifically to manage the conflicts inherent in this new kind of society.
So the core argument we've explored from this source is that the state, private property, and class divisions aren't timeless features of humanity. They arose together out of very specific economic changes and the breakdown of those older social forms.
Exactly. And the implication within the source is that because they arose historically under certain conditions, they might also disappear historically if those underlying conditions change fundamentally again.
Which leaves us with that really provocative final thought from Morgan, quoted in the text. This idea that a society purely focused on accumulating property might contain the seeds of its own destruction. What might that actually look like? And perhaps even harder to imagine, what could that future higher form of the ancient liberty, equality, and fraternity actually entail in practice?
Definitely something to mull over as you observe the complexities of the world around you today.